I was never the type to believe in ghost stories, but after that night, I stopped questioning things I couldn't explain. I had just moved to a small town for work, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and strangers stick out like sore thumbs. My new coworkers invited me for drinks at a bar downtown. Nothing fancy, just a hole in the wall tucked between boarded up buildings. The sign above the door had been worn down to nothing, so I never actually knew its name. Inside, the place had a strange, timeless feel. Dim lights, an old jukebox playing songs decades out of style, and a crowd that barely spoke. The bartender was an older guy with deep lines on his face, his expression unreadable. The air smelled stale, like spilled beer, and something off, something rotten. My coworkers were already there, drinking and laughing, but something felt wrong. The atmosphere was heavy, like the air itself resisted movement. Every time I turned my head, I swore people were staring, but when I looked, they'd be drinking or whispering amongst themselves. Then I noticed something even stranger. No one ever left. I was there for 2 hours, and not one person got up to use the restroom, step outside, or even check their phone. It was like they were trapped in their seats. When I mentioned it to my friend Sam, he just shrugged it off. It's always like this. Best not to overthink it. That's when the bartender slid a drink toward me. It's on the house, he said in a voice that barely moved his lips. I hadn't ordered anything. The glass was cloudy, the liquid inside darker than it should have been. And the smell, it was wrong, like wet earth and something metallic. A bad feeling coiled in my stomach. I'm good, thanks though. The bartender's eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, his pupils looked stretched, unnatural. Drink up. We all do, he said. I turned to my friends, expecting them to back me up, but they weren't looking at me anymore. They were just sitting there, hands on the table, staring at their untouched glasses. A cold sweat broke out over my skin. I stood up. I think I'm going to call it a night. No one reacted. Not my coworkers, not the bartender, not the silent patrons. I backed toward the door. My hands were shaking as I pushed against it. It didn't budge. The bartender tilted his head. Once you sit down, you don't leave until you finish your drink. The air grew thick, suffocating. The jukebox played an old song, something grainy and distant, like a record from another century. I pounded on the door, panic taking over. Let me out! No response. Just silent eyes and untouched drinks. I wasn't thinking. I grabbed a chair and swung it at the window. The wood splintered in my hands, but the glass didn't even crack. The bartender only sighed, like he'd seen this before. And then, the people started changing. Skin darkened, lips curled too wide, eyes turned black like ink spreading in water. My coworkers, Sam, the others, they weren't people anymore. Something clicked. This wasn't a bar. This was a trap. A place where people came in but never left. The bartender placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. You're already part of it now. His grip burned, searing, unnatural heat that sank into my bones. My vision swam, then the room twisted. And then I woke up, outside, in the alley behind the bar. My throat was raw, my hands scraped, like I'd been fighting to get out. But I couldn't remember how I escaped. The building behind me was empty. The door was gone, just a brick wall, as if the bar had never even existed. I ran. The next day at work, I asked about Sam, about the others. Nobody knew who I was talking about. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls, no proof they ever existed. But I remembered. That bar was real. And somewhere, it was still waiting. I never been one to snoop around places I don't belong. But that night, I wish I had just minded my own business. It was a slow Wednesday, and I had stopped by an old bar on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that barely had a name, just a flickering neon open sign, and a door that creaked like it hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, the air was thick, with the smell of stale beer and something older, something damp. The place wasn't exactly falling apart, but it felt forgotten. The wooden floors sagged under every step. The wallpaper was curling at the edges, and the only other patrons were hunched over their drinks, barely speaking. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and just sat there, listening to the low hum of conversation. That's when I noticed it. A door. Not the front entrance, not the bathroom. Something else. It was tucked away behind the bar, half hidden in the shadows. Old, wooden, with a rusted handle. And what caught my attention was that no one seemed to acknowledge it. Not the bartender, not the other patrons. It was like it wasn't supposed to be there. Curiosity got the better of me. When the bartender stepped away, I casually leaned forward. The door had no markings, no sign indicating where it led, just a small keyhole. That's when I heard it. A sound coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft scratch, like nails against wood. I turned to the guy sitting next to me. Hey, you know where that door leads? He didn't look up from his drink. Didn't even acknowledge I had spoken. Weird. I glanced back at the bartender, who was still busy at the far end. My heart was beating faster now. I didn't know why, but something about that door, something about that sound, felt wrong. Then I saw it. The handle turned. Not much, but just enough to send ice down my spine. Someone or something was on the other side. I should have left right then. Should have finished my drink, walked out, and never looked back. But instead, I made the worst decision of my life. I reached out and pulled the door open. The smell hit me hard, rotten, damp, like old earth and something long dead. A narrow staircase led downward, disappearing into darkness. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from below. I don't know what I was expecting. Storage, maybe a cellar. Not this. The steps were old, covered in dust, but the handrail, it was smooth, polished, as if it had been touched recently. My breath was shallow as I stepped down, the floor creaking beneath me. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The air felt thick, like it didn't want me there. Then my foot hit something. A line of deep, jagged scratches running along the wood. And then another, and another. Long, uneven marks, as if something had been dragged down the stairs. That's when I heard it. Not scratching, not anymore. Breathing. Shallow, wet, close. The darkness ahead of me shifted. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted back up the stairs, heart hammering, taking them two at a time. As I reached the top, the bartender was suddenly there, slamming the door shut so hard the walls shook. His face was blank, his voice eerily calm. "You didn't see anything." My chest was heaving. What in the world was down there? He just shook his head. "If you want to make it home tonight, you'll forget about it. Got it?" I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my jacket and walked out of the bar, never looking back. But as I reached my car, I noticed something. The bar's windows, old, fogged up glass. And behind them, the silhouettes of the patrons. Just sitting there, unmoving, not drinking, not talking, just watching. I don't go near that part of town anymore, and I'll never step foot in that bar again. I've been to a lot of bars in my life, but there's one I'll never step foot in again. It was a small place on the outskirts of town, the kind of bar you only find if you already know it's there. No sign out front, just a dim red light above the door. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Faded wallpaper, cracked leather booths, a jukebox that only played songs older than my parents. I was meeting my friend Danny for a drink. He had just moved into that area and said this place had character. That was one way to put it. The moment I walked in, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick, with the smell of old wood and something slightly sour, like rotting fruit. The patrons barely spoke, just hunched over their drinks, eyes darting up at me before looking away. And then there was him, the bar owner. He stood behind the counter, polishing a glass that had already looked clean. A tall man, gaunt, with deep lines on his face and sunken eyes that never seemed to blink. His clothes were old-fashioned, pressed white shirt, black vest, and a tie that looked decades out of style. When he spoke, his voice was slow, almost too deliberate. "First time here?" I nodded. "Yeah, meeting a friend of mine." He didn't respond, just kept polishing the glass, his fingers moving in slow circles. Danny waved me over from a booth in the back. "You made it. Place is a little weird, huh?" I sat down, glancing around. "Yeah, kinda quiet." Danny chuckled. "You'll get used to it." That's when I noticed his drink. The liquid inside was too dark, almost black. But when the light hit it, there was a strange shimmer. "What are you drinking?" Danny hesitated. How special?" Something in his voice wasn't right. Before I could press him, the bar owner was suddenly there, standing beside our table, moving too quietly for someone his size. "You should try it," he said. I don't know why, but my whole body tensed. I'm good with a beer. Thanks, though, I said quickly. The bar owner didn't argue, just gave a slow nod and walked back behind the counter. Danny let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Man, he gives me the creeps. I leaned in. Dude, what's up with this place? Danny hesitated, eyes flicking to the bar owner. Then, in a low whisper, he said, I don't think anyone ever leaves. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean by that? Danny just shook his head, his fingers tightening around his glass. Just don't drink anything he gives you. At that moment, the bar owner looked up, right at us, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a living person. Too wide, too stretched. Like the skin on his face didn't quite fit. I felt sick. I wanted to leave, but something told me walking out too fast would be a bad idea. I glanced around, the patrons at the bar. I finally noticed what was wrong. They weren't talking, they weren't moving. They just sat there, hands on their drinks, completely still. The air felt suffocating. We need to go, dude. Now. Danny's jaw clenched. I don't think I can. What? He swallowed hard. I don't remember how I got here. Panic spiked in my chest. I grabbed his arm. Get up, now. As we stood, the bar owner let out a long, slow exhale. Almost a sigh. Shame, he murmured. And then the lights flickered. For half a second, the entire bar changed. The wallpaper peeled back, revealing damp, rotting wood. The ceiling sagged, covered in black mold. And the people at the bar, they weren't people anymore. Their skin was gray, stretched too thin. Their eyes were dark pits, sunken and empty, lifeless. Then the lights came back and everything was normal again. Except it wasn't. I yanked Danny toward the door. I didn't care if we had to run. The bar owner just stood there, watching, that awful smile still on his face. As we pushed through the door, I heard him say, almost amused, "You'll be back." I don't know how he made it out, but the second we hit the cold night air, it felt like we could finally breathe again. Danny moved away 2 days later. He never talked about that night. I don't either. But sometimes I drive past that part of town, and that bar is still there. Same red light, same door. And sometimes when I look in the window, I swear I see Danny sitting in that back booth, not